Okay, it is now 2 minutes past the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started with our first ever session of our 4-part series for certification preparation as it pertains to the core certification exam. My name is Joe Miller, and I'm the Senior Learning Strategy Manager here at Alteryx. Before we get going, there's a few notes that I'm going to make. Is that this is a live training. I am here in a room right now talking with you, and as such, we want you to be able to ask questions along the way while you have an Alteryx associate in here inside the room. So if you do want to ask questions throughout this session, go ahead and chat us on the Q&A panel. There's also a chat window, but I prefer the Q&A from a proctoring standpoint because I can mark which ones I've addressed and not, which usually results in me not missing any or missing very few and not having to follow up as much. So if you do want to communicate with me throughout this session, go ahead and chat me there. By default, everyone is muted, so that is the only way you would be able to communicate with me throughout this presentation here today. So without further ado, let's get started. And the first thing I'm going to do is just set the scope of what we're about to learn here today. This is a 4-part series, and it will be running throughout the end of November, and I think the last one ends on the last of November. The way we are currently running this is the first 3 sessions are going to be more designer-oriented. So today we're going to be talking a lot about input and output and data types, kind of the 3 most fundamental pieces of workflows and what you should really look out for as it pertains to the certification exam. And then the week following that, we'll be covering some of the prep and blend. And then the week following that, we'll be doing the analysis and any wrap-up questions. And then week 4 is actually going to be exam strategy and approach. So that's how this format is going to be running out. And you can go ahead and subscribe to any of those at community.alteryx.com. And I'm going to jump over here and show you where to find that. If you're looking for any certification resources or live training, you can come to community.alteryx.com. Many of you have been here in order to be in this training today. But you can also see if I jump over to live training here, I've got a breakdown of core certification, the one we're in today, and then parts 2, 3, and 4. Now, if you're looking for more information on certification, I'll point you over to this page. It is also certification.alteryx.com. We'll redirect you right to this page. But there's a lot of information around our certification exams here today, and the depth is there. So if you're looking for what types of tools are covered and processes and really want to fill out the knowledge, that happens here. So the first thing that I'll mention in terms of scope for this certification program is this 4-part series, and even a 4 one-hour sessions, it's going to be hard to walk away just doing this and be successful, right? This is simply a 4-part series to get you started along the path of recognizing what you need to be addressing to be most successful on exam day. So we have to make sure that people are going beyond just some of these sessions and actually practicing Alteryx in order to get there. This all comes back to the idea of training specificity, something you might hear if you run or bike or swim, right, or you do any sports. The best way to get good at something is by doing that. And I know that seems really simple and straightforward, but many times somebody might go biking to improve their swimming, or say it improves their overall fitness, but you won't get it good at swimming without swimming, really. So that's really what we're trying to cover inside this core exam. We want to set you along the right path to be successful. So upcoming trainings beyond this, if you're looking for things outside of this, we do have a time series modeling one coming up on 10/2. And then introduction to regular expressions at the end of October. And then we have those 2 final prep sessions in November, split up by a small section on Alteryx for Excel users. This one will also be helpful for anyone taking that core exam as well. Okay, I'm going to pause there for a second. I am getting some complaints that they cannot hear audio. So I'm just going to ask everybody to enter into the chat window if they can hear me or not. Okay. Thank you. I just want to make sure that I'm not talking to myself here. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to point you to, and it's actually pretty often undersold, or many people might not realize that they're there, especially since they're so new, is that we have prep guides now. We have a prep guide surrounding our Alteryx Designer Core exam and one surrounding our advanced exam. And here I've shown a quick screenshot of one of our really unique tools here. We have a self-assessment. So here we have the actual tool that you might be learning or incurring on this exam, and kind of the difficulty level, right? How difficult is it to learn this tool? How much should you really practice it? You can see the browse tool here is a 1 out of 10. I know it's incredibly small. But there you can kind of tick off which one you think you are. Are you novice? Are you competent? Are you proficient in that tool? And that's going to really play nicely when you make all of these check marks. You actually sum up all those check marks. So if I'm competent, I would check off novice and competent, and essentially summarize all that data to kind of get a reading on how successful I am going to be on exam day, right? And obviously, the hotter you get, the more likely you are going to pass. So this self-assessment's there for you. We don't monitor it, right? So the thing that's really going to be important is self-honesty, right? Being really honest with yourself of where you're at and where you really want to improve, and which tools you think you need to focus on based on how much you know and how difficult they really are. Beyond that, we actually have a curriculum. So if you want to visit each of these sections and you say, hey, I'm not so strong in any of those areas, you can go in and address each of these areas below inside that prep guide. So let me just jump over there. It's a little bit more comprehensive just to look at it. And there's a quick description around the exam, what to expect on exam day, the different categories that are covered, and tools within those categories. Here's our self-assessment that we just showed. And then here's all of the courses that you can click on and just jump into. And we have these nice check marks, right? So you can actually see which ones you've completed and which one you haven't. Now, for anyone on this call, we're always open to feedback to the program. We always want to hear more about it, right? So if you go to all these trainings and you do all these lessons and you do take the exam, let us know how you did. Did you find it helpful? Did you not? Was there one particular piece that was a game changer, or are we omitting something that you think is more important? We'd love to hear your feedback to make sure that for yourself and for people to come, this is a really great resource for people to go to. Inside of this prep guide too, we also have a little bit of a practice exam. So you can see the caliber of questions that are going to be asked, but on top of that as well, you can see some of the some of the formats in which the questions will be asked. So I think a really valuable resource. Down below we have not only the answers, but kind of a justification to the answer and kind of the go forward thinking methodology when attacking these questions, right? So for any of you who have taken the SAT or ACT and gotten one of the study books or the MCAT or whatever type of study, right, standardized test, usually they don't only provide the answer, but why each choice was right and wrong. That's what we tried to do here as well. So let's jump back into the presentation here. And now I did say today there is going to be no template workflow. We're just not going to sit down and build a workflow. I want to introduce you to the concepts. And I'm going to jump into Designer and just do little micro demos, for lack of a better word, just to show some of those ideas in action. So for many of you might know what Alteryx does, right? But we're going to be talking about input data, output data, and the data types today, okay? The first and most fundamental thing to understand about Alteryx is no matter what data source you're connecting to, whether it be web, database, file, what it's going to do is it's going to force it into a tabular format. That is to say that your data will now be structured into a column and row-based data set. So for those coming from an Excel background, you already work with data in a tabular setting. For many relational databases, you might be in that same boat. So that's just the main rule. If I'm reading XML, right, or if I'm reading JSON, inherently semi-structured data, what it's going to do is it's going to try to push it into this structured format. So sometimes things don't play so nicely, and that's some of the challenges that you got to work with inside of Alteryx and in the prep and blend space. But by default, always remember, we're always working within the confines of a table. So for lack, some of these words I use interchangeably, right? So some people say column, some people say field, whereas in the horizontal level, some people say record and row. So if I do say them one way or another, they're essentially synonymous. Now, connecting to a file. There are two main ways to connect to a file. You can connect locally, or you can connect to a network path, okay? So locally, the file path can be absolute or relative, and the file must be unlocked. That means if I am trying to connect to an Excel file, for example, and read it in, but I also have it open somewhere else on my computer and looking at the data itself, it's not going to work. And here's a pro tip. There might be a question on that in the exam. You'll get an error that says the file must be unlocked before execution. Typically, that means that the file is open somewhere else on your machine. So here I have a connection, and you can see this one is relative. Okay, so we'll actually jump into Designer really quick and just demo connecting to a file, and I'm going to point you at some really important things to keep in mind for exam day. So let me just connect to any old file right now, and I'm going to connect to CSV files, because these CSV files, as easy as they are to connect to, they do have some gotchas, okay? So for many people, they just connect, and they're off and running, and they're working inside their workflow. The thing to consider when working with CSV files is that CSV stands for comma separated values. It's simply a text file separated by commas. Now, what you have below this connection piece is going to be very, very important for your certification exams. What you have here is a wide variety of options. And these options, when you see 12 right now, will change based on the type of file that you're connecting to, right? So where I have this capability with some, I'll expose this certain option, but if it's not there, then I will not, okay? So I think really messing around with your workflows is really going to be helpful in your learning experience. Allow me to make another analogy. So for me, for example, I'm really into mountain biking. It's one of my hobbies, and I'm used to pedaling around trails. But they said one of the single most important things that you can do to become a better mountain biker is balance, and the way you do that is by simply messing around in a parking lot, right? It doesn't happen when you have that momentum of actually doing the activity. It's when you're sitting in a parking lot and you're practicing track stands or trying to do these off-kilter turns, right? It's doing all the stuff that you normally wouldn't do on the trail, so when they do happen, albeit them rarely, you can address them. And I think that's really no different inside the Alteryx Designer, because if you're working on your day-to-day projects, you probably are used to working with things in one way and not in a large multitude of ways, right? So you could come in here and just say, hey, I'm just focusing on the input data tool today. Let's click all the things. So for example, what if I just said output the file name as a field, and I said full path, and I run that workflow. Now when I scroll all the way over, you can see I have my full file name. So you can actually play around and see how each of these things change. Now, some of the gotchas as they pertain to CSVs is this first field length, 254. And this will be a discussion that comes up in data types, but by default, each column is set a length of 254. If you have a column that has a description that's 1,000 characters long, it's going to get truncated. So you'll need to make sure that you update that field length here. Additionally, if you have a lot of quotes, right, do you want to ignore commas inside of quotes, or do you not? Do you want to delimit based on that? How do you want to treat it? What kind of code page is it? We don't typically test too much on that, because this tends to be a little bit more of an advanced concept. But for many of these other things, we do test on. So that's a lot of the things that are going on inside of this input data tool. Now, the one additional thing that you'll be tested on that many people don't realize is with a single input data tool, I can connect to multiple files at one time. So what I'm going to do, let me just bring in a comment box and write this out for everybody. One character, and this will become clear in a second. All right. So what if I wanted to connect to multiple files at one time? There are some rules around this, and so it's worth testing out. But as a general rule of thumb, for simple files like CSVs or text files, Excel files are a different beast. Excel files don't count for this. But if they're simple, flat files, you can do this procedure on them. So let me go and connect to my directory here and identify multiple files that I want to connect to. So here's an example of data, San Francisco 2011, 2012, and 2013, that I might just want to connect to at once. If I'm trying to gather all of my history for San Francisco, I'll just want to bring them in together. Many people might tend to do 3 input data tools, which is valid, or you can go ahead and connect to all of them at once. How do I do that? I do this using something called wildcards. So there are 2 types of wildcards inside of Alteryx. One is a question mark, and another is an asterisk. So how do I use these in action? What I could simply do is go ahead and put some wildcard value inside of my path. Now the 3 files that I want to connect to are all in the same directory, but they all have differing file names. The first question to ask myself is, how do they differ? Well, all of them have San Francisco 2011, San Francisco 2012, and San Francisco 2013. So all of them vary based on this one single character. One single character, question mark. There we go. So now it's going to look for any of San Francisco's -201, and it could be any character here. I suppose there could be a file in there called 201A that would work for this. But based on that directory as I have inspected it, it works, and I can run that workflow. Okay. The next thing that I'm going to point you to is this message window. Okay. Some of you are used to clicking on the tools themselves and seeing the actual results. If I were just to click onto the white space, I could see the messages of what's happening inside my workflow. And this is really telling of how this tool is actually behaving right now. So you can see that my input data tool has read in San Francisco 2011 successfully. It has read in San Francisco 2012, and it's read in San Francisco 2013. But wait, what's all this yellow? I have 9 warnings. Let's go ahead and read them. So it has a different field name than employee name, right? So what's really happening here is my first file, San Francisco 2011, had employee name with no underscore between them, but my San Francisco 2012 did. Now the default behavior of this is if it finds out that they differ in name, it will union them positionally. So it'll look and say, hey, you know what, doesn't matter, this data set has 15 and the second one has 15, they must go together. So I'm just going to put column 1 with column 1, column 2 and column 2, column 3 and column 3, so on and so forth. There is some inherent risk to that, right? Because if the columns are out of order, that could be problematic. But that is some behavior. Now, when this will completely fail and not bring in San Francisco 2012 is if it differed on name for everything, and in addition to that, it didn't match the number of fields, right? So San Francisco 2011 had 10 fields, and 2012 had 15, and they're all named differently. It says, hey, you know, that's just too different. I can't handle that right now, and it just moves on. It skips over that file, and you'd see that inside the messages pane. So some of the things to note while I am in here as well is when I do click on the Browse tool, there is no configuration, but we do have this data viewer, right? We do have data profiling available as part of our inline Visualytics. So you can see down here under each column, I've got green bars. This happens to be a pretty clean data set. Here's an example of a non-very clean field. You can see if I hover over it, it'll tell me how many are null, how many are okay, which means no white space. It seems pretty clean. They're not null. And you can see some green indicator. Now, if I were to click through each of these, I could see the stats for each of these columns as it goes forward. Now, if I clicked on overtime pay, this looks like a really odd field, right? Because it's numeric, it's salary data, but this doesn't really make sense. Well, the problem is it's the data type vString, and we'll be getting to that shortly. So it's treating these numbers as words. So what would you do with words? You might just look at unique values. How many people are captains? Right now it's looking at how many people made $245,000, $131.88, which is likely not many in terms of frequency. So that's some of the information that you need to know about input data. Now let me get back to the presentation because there's actually one more piece that goes into this. What if I'm working with a file that requires a little bit more of a strong arming, right? Those San Francisco 2011, 2012, and 2013 were pretty smooth imports, but I really want to step it up a notch and work with something, say, an Excel file, right? An Excel file, while it is one file, you can think of it as a miniature database, right? Because it has multiple tabs, and within each of those tabs, it represents a table. So what we're doing is essentially reading in multiple tables into our workflow at one time. And that's where this dynamic input is going to come in. And this is actually a little bit of a leg up because many people are not familiar with this inside of the core tools of Designer, yet it is one of the most important tools to know inside of the core set of tools in Designer. So what I'm going to do is quickly demo how I might connect to multiple Excel sheets at one time. So I'm just going to delete this old workflow here and connect to an Excel file. Okay. So when I connect to an Excel file, it's going to show me this dialog. And this dialog gives me really three options. The three options are to select a sheet or table. The second is select a named range. And the named range is a specified range within one of your workbooks. It cannot be written there as a part of Alteryx. It's just a way some people work with workbooks if you haven't done that before. And import a list of sheet names. In this case, I'm just going to show you the easiest path, connecting to one sheet at a time, year 2013, or year 2003, sorry. Right, okay. And you can see I'm connected to this file now. I can, from there, choose all these configuration options. You can see instead of the, 12 that we saw in CSV, this one has 7. I could choose, this one's a really interesting one. This is something that you don't get on any other file, is what line to start the import. So for many people, they might have a few header rows at the top of their Excel sheet and their data starts at row 10. You could actually say, start at row 10 for this data for this sheet. So that's an option that you might not see. Now I'm going to pause there for a second because I thought of a good point to bring up to you guys here, is that for these exams, it's not important to know everything. It's important to know how to get to everything, right? So when you go in and see a question on connecting to an Excel sheet, going there and connecting to the Excel sheet is the best thing that you can do for yourself, and then you can prove out the question, right? Because some of these questions, they're so specific that you can't really answer it without actually trying it out. We're actually pushing people into that Designer environment to see if they know how to navigate it and execute in a way that a non-user would not be able to do, right? We want to certify that you can actually use the product and also how to execute on things that you might not know. I'm going to pause there for a second because I do see that there is a question coming in. What does it mean when a field is skipped? So the 3 files pulled in, and 2012 had a different field than the others. So what that really meant, this is going back for everyone for that CSV example where I pulled in 2011, 2012, and 2013. 2012 in that case the file didn't get skipped, right? A file skip means it wasn't imported via the input data tool or brought into the data set. In this case, it was brought in, but it sends some warning saying, hey, things don't seem to be lining up, but I did my best to let you know that, I think I mapped them correctly, but you should go check on it. And that's exactly what we did, right? I know that 2012 is good, and it will union based on position. Now, if the designer sees that, hey, there's a different number of columns, and they're all named differently than they were in 2011, I just don't think it's right to bring them in right now. It'll send you a warning letting you know, hey, I didn't bring it in. I didn't connect to that file. I think you should go inspect it and see if this is a file you really want to connect to. And if so, then maybe clean up that file a bit to make sure it works. There are alternate ways around that, and that's essentially what I'm going to be showing you here is this, dynamic input tool. And even beyond that, there are some macros on Gallery if people are trying to connect data sets together that are just schematically very different. So I've connected to a data sheet here, but I want to connect to all of my year 2003, 2004, 2005, so on and so forth. I want to connect to all of these files, right? And it could be really monotonous to build one single input data tool at a time. What I'm first going to do is select this import only the list of sheet names. Okay? And this is exactly what it's going to do. It's essentially going to query the workbook and let you know everything that's there. And this is really important because this is your opportunity to choose what you'd like to be there and what you wouldn't like to be there. So in this case, I want all of these years in here, but I don't want this high-level controller San Francisco city data piece in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to skip over that first record or remove that first record and keep the remainder. In this case, I'm going to use a sample tool. And here I can just say skip the first row. Now I've got a list of sheet names that I want to bring in and connect to for part of my designer. So I'm going to go in and do dynamic input. Okay. Now I'm going to jump back to my designer my PowerPoint really quickly to let you know what's going on here. So at this point, this is what we've done. We've connected to our San Francisco city controller data, and I've queried a list of sheet names. And now we've brought a dynamic input tool in. Now there are some important things to think about when using the dynamic input data tool. The first of which is this input data source template. And this is required every time you use this tool. And what you're essentially doing is saying, here's the schema that I want to be followed. And for many of us, it might be simply one of these sheets. So when I said schema, that was exactly what we were talking about when we had that CSV problem, right? We had 2011 that had file names with no underscore, just regular spaces between names, and then another one that did have underscores. Which one do I want the designer to follow? Do I want it to look for files that have the space between the names or the ones that have the underscore? And that's what that template's going to do. It's going to choose to say, hey, you do match based on this, or you do not match on this. So you have to set that template, and then you have to read in the list of data sources. And that's exactly what we've done here upstream. We've listed off all the tables that we want to read in, and that's the field that we wanted to use to essentially connect to all those files. So we'll just change that file or table name, saying, how I said in Alteryx, the sheet is the table. So for every sheet name that it comes across, that's essentially a change in the table name when it connects. So what's really happening, if I was to create a visualization, is it would look at that sheet field, look at the first value, and essentially underneath the hood, create its own input configuration file for the year 2003. And it would bring 2003 into my resulting data set. Then it would move on to 2004, create an input data tool under the hood, and then bring that in as part of the data set. So now you can see I have 2003 and 2004 together. And that would keep going, so on and so forth, until it reaches an end. So what I'm going to do is just do exactly what we saw via visualization. I'm going to connect to that file and choose a template. So in this case, I'm pretty sure as an analyst, I've already looked through this Excel workbook and they all match on template, in which case it won't really matter. But this is essentially that rule. What do I want it to follow? Here it's going to generate a preview. Hey, this is the actually go forward schema that we're going to be using. And then I have to set up what list of data sources. So I have those sheet names upfield and done. I'll go ahead and run that. And if I were to click onto my white space and review those messages, you can see exactly what's happening. So you can see it's read in year 2003, 2004, so on and so forth. And now they're all nicely packed into one single data set. I'm going to pause there and see if there are any questions before I go any further. Will this presentation be available after this session? So this session is being recorded, and what we'll do is we'll post this recording right back to the community post that you entered through, so you can go through and rewatch this at any time. So if you're not planning on taking this exam for maybe a month or so, you can certainly come back and watch that recording at any time. Awesome. Data types. So data types are a really interesting beast because you can't really work in Designer without knowing what they are. And for beginning users, they can come off as a little bit more difficult than they really are. So it's one of those things that I like to tell people that, you know, sometimes I think you're overthinking it, right? It's really not as bad as you think it is. So you certainly can get into a lot of trouble with data types in terms of getting stuck and having errors. So that's why it's so important to really understand your data types, and it's so foundational to working inside of Designer. So the first question Oh, thank you for people who are noting that they couldn't hear my audio. I accidentally hit my mute button. So the last I left off, and I'm not sure where I lost you. So at its most basic level, computers communicate in zeros and ones. And they aren't very smart sometimes. That's why programming is so huge today. Programming is essentially writing a list of instructions for computers to follow. Data types are kind of a foundation of all languages, and it's basically telling the computer what you mean by some values, right? So if I gave you the number 43402, how should you interpret that, right? Even you might not know how to interpret that. Is that, you know, a zip code? Is that the amount of sales? How I might treat those is very different. So for a zip code, for example, I might not want to add that with another zip code, right? That would be ridiculous. It's really just a unique value to that zip area. Whereas if it was a sales number, I might want to summarize that. So I have to pose this to my machine saying, hey, not only is this the data, but this is how I want it to behave, right? This is how I want it to be executed. Do I want it to be summed? Do I want it to be just considered as a word? That's really all data types are. And it really can be reduced down to 5 main buckets. And those buckets are strings, numbers, dates and times, Booleans, and spatial objects. And for the purpose of the core exam, you can actually boil that down to 4 because we don't address spatial objects. We address the top 4. So when I go into Designer, you might see all of these, but I actually bin them at a broader level, and each of these selections are really a sub-level of what they represent. So let's start off with strings. Strings are simply the most basic, most universal data type out there on the computer. So when I imported that CSV file, it set it as a string because it doesn't mess with anything. It takes the values as they are. So anything that I went on my computer right now and poked on my keyboard, I could call that a string. And it's really all-encompassing. But at the heart, what I like to say as a rule of thumb for strings is you can think of them as qualitative values, right? So for me, a qualitative value is information about information, right? It could be my my height, for example. It could be my eye color. It could be my zip code. Height might be a little bit of a weird one based on what people might be doing. And essentially it's qualitative in nature, right? Which department does this sale belong to? It's really more descriptive. On the other side of the house, we have numbers, and those are really the 2 most common pieces, right? Numbers are exactly what they sound like, but more often than not, people like to use the numeric data types to do some sort of operators on them, right? So I cannot add words together and have them make sense, but I would want to add my sales together. So that's all strings are, and for most people, these strings mean different things. So the two most basic ones for any English speaker are these two, string and v-string. String stands for a fixed string, it's not written there, and v is for variable string. So when I choose a v-string, and you can see a v-string 254, what's really going to happen is variable takes length into effect. So if I were to select a v-string 254 for a last name field, what it actually does is this size says, hey, I'll take last names up to a length of 254, but if they're shorter, I'll adjust the size so it's a little bit more efficient with my machine, right? So if my name's only 10 long, it will reduce the size down to 10. If I was fixed string, it says, hey, you know, if I was the value of 254, I don't care if your name's 10 characters long, I'm just keeping 254 pieces or characters of length in total for that field value. So it's a little bit more flexible, and in fact, there's very few times that you'd really go down to string unless you're really penny pinching for efficiencies in your machine. The only time we do see string is for something like zip code, if it is a field that you know will always and forever be 5 characters. And even then, that could be an exception because I know some people do the zip code pieces where you add another 4 numbers to get even more specific within a zip code. So even that could have some variability within it. So those are the two main pieces, the fixed string and the variable string. There's just two other deviants of that. So W string is still a fixed string and VW string is still a variable string. What these do is wide characters. So that means a Japanese character, for example, that's something I simply cannot click on a keyboard. I need to have a little bit more space on my machine to process those. So anytime you're working with data that might be Arabic or Japanese or Cantonese, I would choose these W strings to accommodate them. So next up, we have numbers. Now, numbers are exactly what I said before. They're quantitative in nature, but you can see here in the spread box, there's a large group of them, and I think each of them are worth talking about. The first of which, and I think I'll make this delimiter right here, from where my mouse is and above, these represent whole numbers. Okay? Now, int64, int32, int16, and byte, all this really says how big of the numbers they can hold. And if you go to our help documentation, I don't know it even off the top of my head because this is like numbers in the trillions, billions, right? Very large numbers, negative, positive. And down here, it might just go to millions. And down here, it's hundreds of thousands. And here, it's to 254, right? So these first ones represent whole numbers in ranges. And if you go to those help documentation, it'll tell you exactly how big those ranges are. I do not believe we address float anywhere inside of our exams. Now, if I do go to fixed decimal and double, those are kind of the two other remainders. Double is what we say is like our most precise data type. So if you're trying to carry decimals out to the thousands, hundreds of thousands, that's the way to go. But if you are looking to round that, let's say you're working with financial data and you do have thousands of pennies, which isn't uncommon. If you go look at those gas stations, they're always like $3.99 and 9/10 cents. How would you round those up? That might be the fixed decimal, right? So you can look more into those, but it is important to understand all those differences. Okay, next we have dates. This is important to know. This will be on the exam. The format for each of these is 4-digit year, followed by 2-digit month, followed by 2-digit day, all separated by dashes. And you can see hours are on a 24-hour clock, the hour, minute, second. Not only is it important to know how to format these, but it's important to know how to get your data from the format it was in to a date, okay? And that is one of the more challenging things to do because dates can come in a large variety of formats. So my recommendation would be go out to the weekly challenges and check out some of the date time challenges, and you'll see a lot of different approaches on how people attack the problem. Okay, I just got someone saying they can't hear. I'm going to check in again to make sure that people are still hearing me. Okay, still getting people in. All right, perfect. The last one I'm going to address is Boolean. And this came from, I believe the mathematician was Charles Boole. But essentially this mathematician tried to solve everything with Aristotelian logic. So posing some algebraic problem and being able to answer everything with true and false. So this Boolean data type is simply a tribute to that mathematician, which basically says that it's binary in nature, right? Is it true or is it false? It usually is used as some sort of flag value. The final one is spatial objects, and I'll just make a call out that they do exist inside of Designer, but it's something you won't have to concern yourself with. Finally, I'm going to actually say this for our own edification, not actually for the purpose of the exam, is why they're important. Why do you need to know data types? Aside from being able to be successful inside of your Designer, there are certain things that are limited based on the data type that you're working with, right? So arithmetic calculations can only perform sums on fields that are numeric. They can't do it on strings. String calculations like trim or concatenate or just finding a certain string value are only available for fields as marked as strings. And then finally, for the date calculations, and this is probably where it's even the most clutch, is how do I add 5 weeks to the date that's in my data set, right? I can't do that until my date has really become the date data type. So there actually is a whole hour-long training on date calculations that I'd point you to, because if you can do anything inside of there, you should be more than fine. And then finally, when you are working with blending, it is important that if you're joining an ID to an ID and one's a number and one's a string, they won't play nicely. So we recommend that you convert them both to numeric or both to strings in order to join them together. Okay, so how do I actually do that inside of Designer? I'm just going to go in and connect to a CSV. And CSVs are a really great way of practicing because by default, everything is brought in with a vString. So if I were just to run this as a default, let me go look at my data types. How do I look at my data types is probably the first question that you're going to ask. So if I'm looking at my data here, I could go over to my Metadata tab. Metadata meaning data about data. So this is data about my data. You can see all of my field names, what type of data they are, the length, the source, right? For me, I might say, hey, I'm really concerned that I might have values over 254 and they might be getting truncated. I could come to my input data tool, say 1,000, and now you can see my metadata has updated. But there are other things inside of here that I don't think should be strings. Let's say I want to create a sum of the base pay. I can't sum V strings together. And I'll actually show you that, right? I'm going to bring a summarize tool. I'm going to go to my base pay, and let's try to add it together. I'm going to go to my numeric. Oh, no. Where's my sum? I can't do it. Not only on top of that, if I were to go over here, the same problem that we were seeing earlier, if I went over here, went to my data, and clicked on base pay, my inline visualytics doesn't really make sense, right? How many unique values there are of base pay, that's not really something I'm interested in. It's something I'm interested in for job titles, right? There's 1,000 unique job titles, but that might not make sense with that data type. I'm going to point you to 2 ways that you can convert data types. The first one, and simply the easiest one, is this autofield tool. This autofield tool will go through and analyze each of these fields and let you know what it thinks they should be, right? So if it goes through base pay and only sees numeric characters, it's going to say, hey, I think this should be a number. It goes in here and sees alphanumeric values or just alpha values. It's going to say, hey, I think you should keep that a string. Let's just go ahead and run that and take a look at what that looks like. Now, if I were to look at my metadata, you can see that everything has changed. It's kept my employee name as a vString. It sees that they're variable in length and that the longest one is 30, so it sets the size to 30. My job titles, again, are variable in length, and the longest one is 50. Base pay, it sees that they are decimals, but we never set those to fixed decimals. We never round up on behalf of the user, so we set it to the most precise decimal value double. Now this one's interesting, right? Because it changed benefits to string. It's not variable in nature. Let's look at that data really quick. Benefits, well, it isn't variable. It's all fixed, right? So that's why the decision was made. And if you expect it to be variable, you can change it manually another way. But you can see that everything is being analyzed by default with this autofield tool. The last thing that I'll point out is this Boolean value. I think this is pretty cool because the Boolean, being that it was binary in nature, is the smallest data type. Why would it choose that one? Well, because the whole field's null. So it's going to choose the most conservative value to make sure that we're not spending a lot of engine memory working on that. So now, with that autofill in place, I can hit my base pay, go to numeric, and you can see I've got all my values here. I can hit that sum value, and we're off and running. Now, if I were to drag in my browse tool right after that and look at that base salary data again, you can see that it's changed. It's a little bit more interesting now, right? So you can see it's data type doubles. I'm getting minimum, maximum, average. The information is a little bit more interesting. You can see kind of the mean, median mode of the data itself. You can zoom around on some of this data and play around with it. So really cool stuff. So we got 12 minutes left, and I'm hustling to make sure that we do one more thing before we get out of here, and that's talk about some of the output. Oh, actually, I'm going to do one more thing on this data type value, and that's this select tool, okay? So if I wasn't happy with any of those values from that autofield tool and I wanted to change that, like this string field, I could toggle over here and hit vstring and update that value. So now that benefits field is variable. The select tool can also rename and add descriptions to the field. But one of the things that I think people miss out on a lot, and is actually tested on exams, is this options menu. There's a lot of things that can go on here that people might not realize. So what if I wanted to resort these fields? Well, I could right-click and drag them around. But what if I wanted to sort them alphabetically, right? There we go. They're all resorted. So there are a lot of options that you might come into the exam and you might see true or false. You could sort all fields alphabetically with like 3 clicks using the select tool. And most people will say no because they're like, well, I gotta do all this and that's more than 3 clicks. You know, you might want to dig in and make sure that you understand everything that's going on inside this options menu. So like I said, click on all the things and you'll actually be surprised how much you learn along the way. Okay. So, the final piece, I'm going to reconstruct one of our workflows that we had earlier. Need to bring in my dynamic input. Choose one of these values. It's loading. Okay. So, oops, I need to make sure that I'm choosing the actual table name. Okay. So, let's say, for example, and this comes to the output data tool, that I actually have done some sort of analysis on my data set, right? So let's say, for example, I just go into fiscal year and do a group by, and I'll do a sum of value, right? Really simple example. I'll go ahead and run that. So now I have the sum of value that's going on each of these years, okay? What if I wanted to output this to a file? Well, simply dragging in an output data tool, dropping it onto the canvas, I'm going to go File, Save As, and I'll just save it to my desktop as, let's just say, an Excel file. So I'll call this my demo file, and it's going to say, what do you want to name this table? And I'll call this my overview. Right? Now I've run this workflow. Now that I've configured this workflow, I can run it. I believe that one gotcha that you might want to look out for this exam is I can run this once and it works beautifully. If I run it again, not so much. Check out the error. Sheet already exists. We've actually run this workflow and already created the file, so it can't create a new sheet that already exists. So if I just wanted to update it every time I run, I just hit overwrite sheet, and then I could run it infinite times. But just like the input data tool, this menu that you're seeing here is drastically going to change based on what type of file you're writing to. Okay, so it's really important that you try playing around with all the different options that you have available via these menu items. Now, the last piece that I'm going to point out that is tested is that I could output 12 files from this one tool. And why do I say 12? Well, let's say I wanted to create one sheet inside of my Excel workbook for the year 2003, the year 2004, the year 2005, so on and so forth. I could do that here. So I'll do it as an even more compelling argument down here before we summarize it, because there's going to be many 2003s. So I'm going to output each of these again, and I'm going to do it to my demo workbook, and I'm going to call this foo. Now, foo is essentially a table placeholder name. And what I'm really going to do is I'm going to say, change the entire table name, remember table being sheet, to the fiscal year, right? And what it's going to do is it's going to create a tab for the year 2003 and put all the year 2003 data in it, one for the year 2004, and all the 2004 data inside of it. Now, I chose foo to name it because I'm just going to replace that whole name anyway with what those entity names are. But there are also other options like append prefix, right? What that would do if I appended a prefix is it's going to say 2003 foo, right? I'm prefixing this table name foo with the fiscal year value. So it's 2003 foo, 2004 foo. I don't want that. I just want the entire name to be replaced. I'm going to go ahead and run that workflow. And you can see in my messages window, I've not only read them all in, but I've also read them all out. And previously in this file, I've written that overview file. So let's go ahead and explore that Excel file just to prove that it did what I expected it to. Year 2003, 2003 data, 2004 with 2004 data, so on and so forth. So I know we went through that really fast, but we are going to post that up back on Community after this session. So if you want to review any of these methods that I showed you here today, feel free to check it out there. Beyond this, if you want to learn more, and there's one area that you want to dig into a little bit more, there's a training for each of these pieces. We have a training on dynamically inputting data. We have a training on dynamically outputting data. We have training on changing data to data types. It's all there, and it's available for the taking. Feel free to go to that Alteryx Academy site, though, and use our prep guides if you want to understand a little bit better on some of that direction. And of course, if you have technical support as it relates to how that product might be functioning and you don't think it's behaving as it should, reach out to support@alteryx.com. But if you have a question around support on the certification exam, go ahead and contact us at certification@alteryx.com. So at this point, that's all I have for everyone today. I'd like to thank everyone for joining. I know there's actually less questions than I expected throughout that session. So I'll just pause here at the end of the session and just answer any questions that might come up. If not, I will see you next week. So just curious, do you have more developer-oriented training? My question is, are you a developer in the sense of Alteryx workflow developer, or are you looking for more like SDK developer type of training? Oh, yes. So if you want to go in and see what each of these tools are doing, I would recommend hitting some of the core concepts trainings. So let me just pull up live training here, and I'll show you a really cool resource that I like to point people to, and it's relatively new. So if I went to this live training, and I went to the index and welcome at the top of the panel, each of these things I've listed here is essentially one of these 1 hour long trainings. So you can see we have, gosh, over 100 hours of training available here. But if I just want to start off at the bare bones, right, at a very beginner intro level, and we have them tagged as such, I could hit Designer 101, right? If you want to go in and do something a little bit more aggressive, like data investigation preparation for predictive modeling or regression modeling, we all have that there as well. So the roadmap between this and all the other different components of Academy are laid out in our preparation guide, so those should be available for there. So there is a question on SSIS. We actually have Alteryx for SSIS developers right here instead of our live training. So the question that came through says, let's say I have a folder with 10 Excel files for 10 years and 1 file per year, but I would like to upload the file for the current year. Is that possible? Absolutely. So it really depends on a number of different ways that you'd like to approach it. But one tool that I'll point you to that's really easy, and this is totally a bonus question because I think this does show up, is this Date Time Now tool. So this tool, what it's going to do is it's just going to return the time or the date of today, right? So I could come in here and run that and say, hey, it's 2018-09-25. I could go in here and bring in a directory tool. And these are the two main components. So let me navigate to a directory that might be interesting. Well, yeah, let me just find an interesting directory. Okay. This directory tool, what it's going to do is it's going to give you a lot of information about what files exist there, right? So I can see San Francisco 2013 in here. This is what we were working with before. But you said you wanted to work with just the current year. Right now, I don't have a current year one. But what I would likely do is I would go in here, pull in a formula tool, and I would alter this Date Time Now just to take the first 4 characters, 2018, and then use that to join to this data set. I guess it depends on what your name is. So let's say it was 2018 countries. Let me just mock that up right now. Plus dash right. Oh, the string size is 10. We'll call this file name. So now I've created that file name based on the current year. So what I would do is I go in here and join my file name to my file name for my directory. And right now I don't have 2018.years. Let's open that directory right now and just make up our own 2018 file. So I'll do 2018, I guess it was counties.csv. So theoretically, if I actually got them right, I have the current year file pulled, and now I could use that dynamic input tool to bring in that file and read it into my Alteryx designer. So I know that was a long way around the solution, but That's how you get there. You use a dynamic tool like this to sense or detect what year it is, and then use that to match up against some sort of directory that you're looking in, and then based on what you want to filter out of there, read them in using a dynamic input tool. Okay, I don't think there's any more questions. So thank you everybody for joining, and we'll see you in a few weeks for the session 2. Appreciate you joining, and we'll see you next time.